So this caused a little bit of a stir. Where is it? And I had opinions about this. I just forgot to do it. Oh, is the open beta test happening? Oh, the open beta test happened. Okay. Despite hard efforts, Europe is still standing. You know, sometimes you just gotta pick your battles, Jerry. I wanted to see here. I think this is what I was looking for. The other day, we announced that skills performed using both simple and technical inputs which share the exact same properties. Reactions came pouring in, and I've been doing my best to read as much as possible. From the comments we received, the most common were requested to retain some form of disadvantages for simple inputs and questions regarding why we leave the option for technical inputs. I can see where they're coming from, and I'd like to take this opportunity to shine some light on how this decision was made. Okay, so essentially, what the crew at Granblue versus announced is that the simple inputs and the technical inputs are going to be the exact same. There's going to be no damage penalty, kind of like there is in Street Fighter. There's going to be no mana penalty like there is in DNS. And people are all up in arms about it. And my question is, or not necessarily my question, but my opinion on this is the following. With very few exceptions, I feel like we as a community are worried about what other people are doing too much and not enough on what we're doing. Right? And this is the same kind of discussion with the modern inputs for Street Fighter 6. Same discussion for hitbox or whatever. Granted, the hitbox stuff did have some valid concerns. But I think this all comes down to, with very few exceptions, the reason why you lose is not because of what the other person is playing, or is not because of how the other person is playing. Does that make sense? Like, unless you're like a blue, or unless you're like a top player, the reason why we lose, and I'm including myself in this too, the reason why we lose is not because the other person is playing simple controls or because the other player is playing modern controls. The reason we lose is because we're making mistakes. You feel me? So I feel like this kind of an outcry because of a mechanic being in this, like, because of a control scheme being in the same footing as a classic control scheme is 100% unwarranted. Right? Like, I don't care if my opponent, nor do I think anybody should care if our opponents are just mashing one button to get a full combo. Who cares? We're playing our game. Let them play theirs. We just got to be the better fighters. Like, that's all there is to it. I truly don't see why this is a big issue. And I don't know if my opinion is just incorrect. Or I don't know if my opinion is not taking stuff into account. Crimson Wanderer says, I don't think it's about winning or losing a match. Then what is it about? Because at the end of the day, if you want to play with complex controls, you have the complex controls. And if you want to play with simple controls, you can play with simple controls, right? To me, with this change, the motion inputs are redundant. Yeah. Aren't they always, though? Like, specifically when you have modern controls in Street Fighter 6 that also have the motion inputs. They should just hard commit and remove the motions at this point. I don't think I necessarily agree with that, just because I think motion inputs provide a certain comfort to legacy skills, if that makes sense, right? I feel like I have a harder time learning a game with no motion inputs than a game with motion inputs, if that makes sense. And even if they're redundant, I still plan on using motion controls, right? Or motion inputs, rather. So to me, having the option is the most important thing, whereas not having the option is what can come out as damaging. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. Because I think that's been my big issue with like these discussions about modern controls and these discussions about simple inputs and all complex inputs, manual, turbo, auto, whatever. To me, it just has to come down to find what you're comfortable with and play that. And as long as they give you the option, that's all I care about, right? Like, just give me the option to use my motion inputs. You can give somebody else the option to use one button specials. Whatever, man. We'll just play the game after that, you know? Because it's at the end of the day, it comes down to a comfort thing. And even if you're not thinking of the game as competitive, like, it just comes down to a comfort thing. So the more options available, I think, make things better for everybody. And the outcry because other people are going to play a certain way is invalid in my opinion. Right? I hope that makes sense, and I hope people understand where I'm coming from here, because I'm having a hard time finding like why there is such an outcry. Crimson Wanderer's response is, I see your point, but I think they're clearly catering to a different audience and should just commit to that audience. Well, don't you agree that certain parts of a game can cater to a certain audience and certain parts can cater to others? Why work harder if your one button can do the work? But in a competitive scene, I feel like one or the other must be a standard. I disagree with that. And again, it's all down to comfort, right? Like, you can give, as long as I have the option, I will most likely just use motion inputs, right? And it's a comfort thing. It's not necessarily like, oh, this is better, this is worse, blah, blah, blah. No, I just like doing motion inputs better. And the fact that they have that option, to me, is the super important part, right? Even in a competitive setting. Like, just having the option to do it, I think, is the best outcome. Because because having the multiple options and having multiple ways of playing the game, I think helps people I think helps people get into the game, even if the options are the same, right? How it skews gameplay and decision making is? What, by having the one button inputs, UGK? Yeah, UGK is saying the option isn't the issue, it's how it skews gameplay. And again, I think it goes back to what I was saying earlier, where I think I don't know if maybe I just haven't played enough games that have had these multiple options, but I don't think it skews gameplay that much. I could be completely wrong, and I'm perfectly fine being wrong. But from my experience so far, the erosion of culture? Okay, I can see where that's going for sure. UGK, I think I see your point where the way of playing is changing. And because the way of playing is changing, the quote unquote antiquated ways, which is the way of how we currently play, right, with motion inputs, with classic controls, as it were. Are you guys fearing that those kind of controls are going to be gone in the future? Is that where this outcry is coming for? This topic would be a great weekly debate topic. I agree. I think maybe I just don't have all of the information. Yo, what up, Blue? Everybody give Blue a round of applause, will you, for 57 months he's been subscribed. Good to see you, my friend. I'm so happy you were here just while we were covering this. So, Blue saying, on this topic, I use both as a top Granblue versus player. Having both is good, and there was good incentive to have people have to learn. But yeah, UGK is kind of right with how the culture is changing, and people do not like that culture where that culture is going. Okay, I can see that. Yeah, the fear that classic inputs are no longer going to be a thing in the near future. I can see that. Okay, I think I can understand it better that way. You would like to have a longer form convo, dude. Now that I don't have a job, maybe I'll be coming to UFO more often. Let's be real. I'm probably not going to leave my house. I'm probably going to leave my house even less now. But with that said, I think I kind of see the point now, where much like how I prefer to use motion inputs and classic controls, if motion inputs and classic controls are completely missing from future games, I do think that would be hard for me to pick up games, in the sense that I think it would be hard for me to enjoy playing the games as much as I do now, right? So I think I understand where you're coming from with that point. And to that, I don't have an answer, right? Like, to that, I am not in the dev room. I don't know what these people are thinking or what they're doing. Maybe Project L is a good indicator, right? Because Project L doesn't have any motion inputs at all, right? It's just like a direction button and a button, right? Like, there's no like special moves. I think there's special buttons, kind of like Rising Thunder did. Blue says, I played the Granblue versus beta, and I still did both, but I do think that the culture of fighting games being hard is dying. Yeah, I don't think I disagree with that. And the game's audience isn't focused anymore at the competitive players. I don't disagree with that. And to be honest, I feel like that's the correct way of approaching things, right? Because, with very few exceptions, sorry, my phone is blowing up. With very few exceptions, things turn competitive not because they had the goal of being competitive, right? I think things turn competitive because they're good to play and people are passionate enough about making it competitive, right? I think Smash Brothers Melee, I think, is the best. What do you call it? The best example of this, I think, right? Where it's meant as a party game, but because there are so many people who are so passionate about that game, they've turned it into a giant scene, right? That has been crazy for like the past 20 or so years, right? And they're still around. Crimson Wonder says, I think what casuals care about is single player content. I don't agree with that. I don't know if I agree with that. And to that point, I also don't agree that casuals would like simplified inputs over simple inputs. Also, something crazy about this apartment is like somebody owns a chicken in this neighborhood. And whenever they're walking around, they're loud as shit. I don't know if you guys can hear it. It's crazy. I'm not used to that. Just fucking chicken. Like it just completely took me out of the conversation. But yeah, I think viewing it as black and white, competitive and casual is not the way to go. In one sense, I think there's a lot of gray areas, right? Like I don't think we need to see like one group of people as a monolith, because there are like a big example, a huge example of this. Big example of this is at CEO. I sat down and played with somebody named Jesse. He's apparently part of a group called the Nerds Podcast, I think. But we sat down, we were playing Street Fighter 6, and we had a blast. And he does not play the game competitively, but he's just a huge fan of Street Fighter, right? And he knows how to do charge moves, he knows how to do motion inputs, and changing that is a negative, right? Like having the modern inputs is not what he thinks of fighting games, right? So the important thing I think coming out of this, and I think the worry that is coming out of this that I didn't see before, but I do see now after this discussion, is that because these new control types are coming in, people are fearing that the classic controls are on the way out. So then again, I go back to my point to what I was saying earlier, is having the option is the most important thing, right? Like having the option for people to play the game in the classic way and having the option for people to play the game in a classic way or in a modern way. Also, I use classic and modern loosely, right? I think having the option to do both is what's going to keep everybody happy. But I think I'm understanding the fear that like it's things are changing, right? And at the end of the day, if developers do decide to change things in this way, yeah, I mean, I think to me that's a negative, right? But to a lot of other people, that's not necessarily a negative. So I think it's going to be one of those things where we might just have to vote with our wallets, man. Change is upon it. Yeah, like UGK is saying, change is upon us, man. And did I just hear gunshots? NorCal's weird. I'm hoping it's just somebody hammering something and not a gunshot. But with that said, where was I going with my point? Oh yeah, I think the fact that so many fighting games exist, I think it's hard for me to imagine that there won't be something for everybody, right? And as hard as it is to admit, and I say that from my perspective, it is difficult to admit this. If I am not the target audience, like if the target audience are people who prefer modern controls and one button combos, then so be it. I'll go play something that has something else. And it might suck because, in a way, removing classic control or removing motion inputs and kind of, as people were saying, like changing the culture of it around inputs for the sake of accessibility, ironically kind of removes accessibility, if that makes sense. Right. Am I making sense? I hope I'm making sense. Anyway, I hope I'm like seeing what you're saying and taking that into account. Because it is difficult to have this conversation when I'm a person holding a microphone and I'm reading text from everybody else. Animate Sam says that his buddies and him were joking about a modern Luke getting top 8. Dude, so be it, right? There's a what was it? Wasn't there that Japanese player that like absolutely beat the shit out of Takedo recently? I don't know if it was in a Topanga event or something, or if it was on SFL, but he was playing modern Marissa, and then he lost the game and he just switched to classic Marissa and then like beat his opponent even worse. Haitani's in top 50 overall with modern Trin. Yeah, I mean, and I mean the conversation then is different when we're hey Q Ball, thanks for the follow on Twitter. The conversation is very different when we're talking about top players and competitive play, right? And as much as I want to call myself a top player, I know for sure I'm not, and I know for sure that that is not something I should be worried about as of right now. Are one button super is kind of annoying, sure, but then I just gotta not get one button supered. But yeah, at least that's my take on it. I could be completely misconstruing it. I could be completely missing something. In which case, I'm happy to pontificate on it further.